All right. Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I see others are joining as we speak. We're a minute or two after the hour, so let's go ahead and get started. So first, thank you everyone for joining. Really excited about the webinar today. We're going to be doing a live fireside chat on the topic of the state of digital accessibility in 2021, and really appreciate everyone's time. So before we jump into meeting the panelists and jumping into the discussion, let's tackle a few housekeeping items. So first is the fireside chat format, as mentioned. The session will be recorded, and we will be sending out a recording and a full transcript after the webcast, and that can be made available as needed. From a Q&A perspective, there is a chat feature on the GoToWebinar platform. That is the best place to direct your questions. The panelists and myself will see those questions, and we really are encouraging everyone to direct those questions during the discussion as well as after. So if there's a question that comes up that's pertinent to the conversation at hand, we'll incorporate that into our conversation and try to keep this as interactive and engaging as possible. So with that, let's meet our panelists, and I'll introduce myself as well. So we have a really fantastic panel here of industry experts. I'm going to provide a brief introduction of each panelist, and then we'll go right into the discussion. So first, Dina Wainwright is the VP of Enterprise Digital Accessibility at Wells Fargo. We're really thrilled to have Dina on with us today to offer some of her unique perspectives on the space. As someone with her own disability, Dina has devoted over 25 years to making digital products and services accessible to and usable for people with disabilities. Prior to Wells Fargo, Dina worked at Sun Microsystems, now Oracle, SAP, and HP. And then next we have Kevin Most, who is a managing director at Logic 2020. So really excited to have Kevin on. Logic 2020 is a highly respected digital consultancy specializing in a number of really interesting areas in the digital world, one of which being digital accessibility. So Kevin is recognized for his experience with accessibility, data privacy, and data governance. He has 30 plus years of experience successfully delivering business and technical projects and has lent his expertise to several prestigious industry panels on data privacy, data governance, and other topics. And then finally, last but not least, my friend and colleague at Crown Peak, Catherine Putt. Catherine Putt is a director in our digital quality management business. Catherine works directly with the sales and customer success teams at Crown Peak, supporting product demonstrations, business case development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. She wears a lot of hats. So Catherine helps organizations create best practice governance processes utilizing the DQM tool. And in her nighttime job or night shift, she's running and delivering our DQM sales enablement program. And finally, I'm Chris Segala. I'm the Chief of Staff at Crown Peak, as well as the General Manager of our digital quality management business, and excited to be acting as the panelist or the moderator here for this excellent sort of panel discussion. So let's jump into the agenda before we start our Q&A session, just to give you a sense for some of the topics that we're going to be covering. Of course, we'll see how the conversation plays out, as well as some of the questions that we get in, but we will be touching on really just defining, what digital accessibility means to us as a common set of definitions. We'll talk about the current state of digital accessibility, exploring the opportunities and challenges for organizations in addressing this aspect of the digital world, and how to demonstrate value and impact for the business. And of course, we'll handle some Q&A at the end. So to kick off the conversation and kind of get our juices flowing, we had a quote here, a pretty famous quote for those who are kind of practitioners in the space have probably seen this. Tim Berners-Lee, credited as one of the inventors of the World Wide Web, made a famous quote years ago: "The power of the web is in its universality." access by everyone regardless of disability is an essential aspect. So really kind of the essence of what we're discussing here today around digital accessibility. And it's a good place to start because, one of the first topics we wanted to cover was establishing that sort of common definition on digital accessibility and kind of taking a personal view of what it means to the panelists. So Dina, I'll start with you. If you want to give a quick response here in terms of, what does digital accessibility mean to you?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So, I mean, for me, obviously, as you said, I have my own disability. And so accessibility for me obviously goes beyond a job that I do every day, because I'm personally impacted when products and services are or are not accessible, right? So it impacts my ability to be independent, my ability to parent, particularly in the middle of a pandemic. Examples would be things like online learning materials, right? So I would say that what it means to me is something very personal, and which is why I've devoted so much of my time and energy to making it easier for people that come after me to do the things that I have been challenged to do.
Yeah, that's amazing. And, I think we can collectively sort of agree and sympathize that, in this space there's a common mission for those that are, practicing digital accessibility and enabling, better digital accessibility processes. It's really to do just that, what you just explained, to remove those barriers and level the playing field. So that's fantastic. I appreciate that response. So Catherine, do you want to share a bit from your perspective on what digital accessibility means to you?
Yeah, definitely. For me, digital accessibility is about, helping to remove and break down barriers to provide inclusive experiences for everyone, no matter what type of disabilities they are. I think specifically it's about helping organizations to, create digital accessibility as part of a wider diversity and inclusivity program inside those organizations. So really just helping to make sure everyone has the same type of interactions and experiences, no matter what type of disabilities they do have.
Great. Thanks. Now that we've kind of established some of the common denominators around what it is and what it means to us, let's get into some of the conversation around the state of digital accessibility. Let's try and kind of break it down into sort of a simple summarized view of where we are today and what that means to each of us. So Kevin, if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Because obviously last year was an interesting year, I think, for everybody. Obviously with the pandemic, everybody's being pushed online. More and more companies are talking about inclusion and diversity with all the events that happened in the past year. However, I honestly still don't hear a lot about accessibility. I think I read somewhere that 90% of companies claim to prioritize diversity, but less than 5% actually consider disability in those initiatives. And so even in this day and age, it's rare that I've seen companies take a proactive approach to set up an enterprise program. It's typically in response to a lawsuit or a demand letter. And I believe that a big part of the problem today is the lack of knowledge of what digital accessibility really means and how important it is, as well as how to implement a program around it. Dina, I'm sure you have different perspectives. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would agree for sure that the pandemic has made it glaringly obvious who is committed to accessibility and who is not. I think one of the things about implementing a program in a large enterprise is that the humanization piece is really hard to make sort of to infiltrate the enterprise with that human aspect. And I think honestly that is the essential component of making digital accessibility real, right? I think that when a developer, when a designer is able to see firsthand that the decisions that they make have a real impact on real people in their real lives, that often changes their perspective, their level of commitment to accessibility. I think that a lot of times there isn't a recognition of just how much power someone who does design and develop products and services has on the outcome for human beings. And so I think it's that. And I think it's also that, people are incredibly afraid of what they don't understand, or of things that they themselves would not want to confront, right? And so I think there's a lot with disability around, oh my God, like how would somebody function if they couldn't hear, see, walk, whatever the case may be. And when you don't want to put yourself kind of in your mind in that position, right? Your brain doesn't want to go there. It's easier, kind of like what you were saying, Kevin, from a diversity perspective, to leave that element out because you just don't want to go there in your brain.
Yeah, I would definitely also build on that, Dana, because I find a lot of organizations just generally find it overwhelming. It's a large kind of thing to be able to tackle, especially digital accessibility. A lot of times I feel organizations are kind of doing it as a mitigation exercise or risk mitigation exercise after the fact. It's not, people need to be bringing digital accessibility to the forefront of, web design, thinking about it from the UX perspective. But, a lot of people won't necessarily have experience in terms of the wide range of disabilities that we do need to be catering for. So being able to kind of bring that, to the forefront of the discussions about designing a new website or app, or how people would be interacting with it.
Yeah, those are excellent points. And I think, Dina, the aspect you touched on, humanization, the humanization piece of this is what caught my attention a lot. And I think we'll have an opportunity to kind of dig into that a bit more as we get through some of the other discussion points. But I think from my vantage point, that seems to be a critical component of what separates the good and the bad, and how we've seen better adoption over time is just embracing that human aspect of what digital accessibility means. So that, I thought that was an excellent point. So that is our next sort of discussion area, is this idea, and Catherine touched on it too, that it is a large undertaking, and it's very clear that it is a challenge and a huge obstacle to overcome to address these things well. But there are companies that are doing this well out there, and we've seen it in our own experience, and kind of, you can browse the internet and start to get a sense for where companies have embraced this better than others. So I wanted to kind of dig into that topic a bit more in terms of what does good look like in this space, and how are companies starting to achieve this.
This is Catherine. I'm happy to jump in there. So the main thing that I feel, well, helping organizations to build out and create best practice governance processes with a focus on accessibility, one of the key things that I always look for or try to, work with my clients on is getting executive buy-in for accessibility as a priority for those organizations. This involves being able to talk about the value of accessibility, so more than just having an accessible website, but helping them to be perceived as an accessible brand or inclusive brand, and the ability to support a wider range of clients. And it also has benefits for able-bodied users as well, just for being generally better able to interact with the websites and be able to create a better digital experience. But that key is really that executive buy-in, and that just trickles down throughout the organization.
Yeah, Catherine, I completely agree with you. Executive buy-in is definitely critical in order to get the funding and support. And it's those that can really tackle some of the issues of why companies aren't doing it well, the lack of understanding, the lack of technical knowledge. I think there's a perception issue as well, that they feel like they're giving something up around aesthetics or usability. And for a lot of companies, it's an afterthought. So the ones that can really tackle that well, top down, are going to have an advantage and help figure out, the value, which I think we're going to talk about value as well. But stop trying to do just the minimum. The ones who are thinking about the right way are the ones who find ways to embed it in their methodology, their way of thinking, kind of tied in their business goals, and really embed it into their culture. So as Dina said earlier, really trying to humanize and understanding, here's the big impact that we can have, and get everyone bought into that culture. Dina, are you aware of companies doing this well, or at least aspects of it well?
Yes. So, I mean, what I would say to some of this is yes, absolutely. Creating an accessible product or service is really important. But where you are going to get the community to buy into you, to be, sort of that undying loyalty, it's more than that. It's in the things that extend beyond the services and the products you provide to define yourself. So a couple of things, right? When you create an accessibility program, the title that you assign to the person who is in charge of that, it matters, right? People think it's semantics, but I think about the community and how they responded when IBM was the first company to appoint a chief accessibility officer, right? And then Microsoft appointed Jenny as their chief accessibility officer. And that says to a community, like, this is a company that values this so much that they're willing to put this in the C-suite, right? And then beyond that, it's things like, one of the most powerful examples I saw recently was Apple, when they did their product launch in September, when they launched some of I think it was the watch and the new phones. Their event was completely audio described. And it was audio described in such detail that it was, for me, it was like I was there. Like it was down to the detail of, there is a spotlight shining on the new blue iPhone, which is sitting on a velvet table. Like it was so detailed. And so when you have a company that goes to that level of effort to show the community that they get it, that they want that community to be fully engaged in what they're doing, those are the things that make the community stay with that product.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I'll have to check out that that Apple event, and just to get that perspective from yourself, Dina, is interesting, and right away, create some affinity and some loyalty back to Apple, even as an able-bodied person, right? Just the fact that they're able to address that to that extent is quite impressive. So moving on to sort of the next point here, and we touched on it here, right? Executive buy-in, that top-down, cultural initiative, and how that permeates throughout an organization. That's a key factor here, and at the end of the day, what allows an organization, or what factors contribute to an organization sort of adopting that at a high level and permeating throughout an organization? So how do organizations prioritize it? What's driving it as an imperative or not? What are some of those factors that are pushing leaders to begin adopting more progressive digital accessibility programs? But Dina, maybe we'll go to you. I think maybe what you're touching on there at the end of the last segment is applicable to start the conversation here.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, right, like Catherine said, people do this for a lot of reasons, right? They do it from the strictly compliance reason, right, which, causes buy-in from a, holy cow, we're in financial trouble, reputational trouble. But I think, again, I would go back to humanization. So I think about Satya Nadella, who is the CEO of Microsoft, who has a child, I think he's actually older now, with a disability. And so for him, it is an incredibly real experience. And I've watched him stand up in front of tens of thousands of developers at their conferences and just tell that community, this is just what we do. This is Microsoft. We make products for everybody. And so I think, again, it's it's one thing to do this from the compliance perspective. It's a whole other to show the community, the company that you are leading, that you have an investment, like a true investment in how this goes.
Mm. And it kind of again goes back to the core values of the organization and the leaders, and kind of being more embracing of these as kind of key
Right.
tenets to the organizational
But to
health.
But to Kevin's point earlier, though, a lot of companies have that in their handbook, right? Like they go, yeah, we D&I, that's our value. But when it comes to, walking that walk and truly demonstrating D&I as a value, many of them don't. So they write it down, but they don't live it.
Well, I think I think, Dina, you hit it exactly on, right? I mean, this could be part of their social responsibility, but do they really value that? I think the numbers, when you look at it, 60 million adults in the US live with a disability. That's roughly 1 in 4. And I think I read that 1 in 5 have a disability that may affect their ability to use the internet. So it's very prevalent out there. And it is true, most companies seem to only do this when they're forced to do it. And when they're forced to do it, they're doing the bare minimum. And I think part of that is just getting lost in how much there is to do and not knowing where to start. I have seen companies that have, as you mentioned, a digital accessibility leader or an accessibility leader, and it's a smaller group, and how they get that throughout the organization is challenging, and how they get buy-in from everybody else, when typically one of the questions asked is, can you show me the value from doing it? And sure, you can look at value and ROI, which we get into later, but it's not just about that. It's about being, as you said, being inclusive, making sure that everybody has reduced barriers, the same opportunity to do whatever they need to do, whether it's in an organization as far as working, whether it's shopping on the internet. There's so many different aspects of it that I think companies have a tough time knowing where to start. Catherine,
Yeah,
I don't know if you're seeing this.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, Kevin. It is a challenge understanding where to start, and it's quite interesting for me because I'm based in London, and I work primarily with a lot of North American clients as well as in Europe, and there's definitely quite a shift and a divide between the conversations. I think America, it is very much driven by risk mitigation. I'm afraid of lawsuits, whereas in Europe, it's about talking about that value that it can bring to the organization, and more of that human element. So it is two different conversations that are having in terms of driving the accessibility initiatives across the two different regions.
Great. So we'll kind of move the conversation along here. We've established that it's challenging, and there's a number of factors that are kind of driving prioritization of this. But maybe just to dig in to kind of make it clear, right? In terms of the perspectives we're sharing from the panel, like, why is it so hard? What makes digital accessibility a challenging project to take on and to be successful with? Maybe Dina, I think you started the last one, so we'll stay on that trend if you want to kick us off on this one.
So I think Catherine, I think it was Catherine who hit, it might have been Kevin, but the knowing where to start thing, I think, is really important. I mean, when we used to leave our homes and go places to live events, I used to hear a lot from people, somebody made me the accessibility program manager for our enterprise, and I have no idea what to do first. And so I think, like, it is at first very overwhelming. Like, how do you even scope something that big, let alone like actually solve a problem that big? So I think it's partly that. And then I think, again, when you have a really large enterprise, like Wells has 250,000 employees, right? It's, it's hard to centralize efforts because you've got businesses who have these brilliant accessibility subject matter experts in them, who have these fabulous ideas, who have initiative and they're passionate and they're committed, and so they start to do their own amazing thing. And then you talk to other businesses and you find out that they are doing their own amazing thing, but they're trying to achieve the same goal, right? So how do you literally find all the projects and initiatives in an organization that is that big?
Yep. Yep. And I think, Catherine, maybe that hits home a bit for you too, in terms of your role at Crown Peak and working with, governance teams to, enable those programs to start to implement and think through
Yeah.
execution. So any other
Yeah.
things to add there?
It's yeah, so definitely when you're feeling about how people, a lot of the organizations I speak to, when I start to talk to some of these developers or content editors, they've never encountered anyone who would be using any type of assistive technology. They've never heard of, or some of them have never heard of the main types of screen readers or how people would actually use them to interact with content. So to me, it's a lack of understanding of the problem and how they actually fix it, because they've never had any experience in terms of integrating, their thoughts about how they would create this great experience for people who would be interacting with the site in this way. I think there's also a lot of disabilities out there that they need to consider, that they haven't, autism or dyslexia, about how they would be interacting with the content. So it's such a broad range of things that we need to cover. People do find it overwhelming, but once you start to talk them through, this is how they would be navigating the website, or this is how they would be interacting with the content, how do these images make you feel, how can you then translate that experience to someone who can't actually see what's happening on the screen. So it's really about just talking them through, understanding to each of those different people. And I think another one of the challenges, as Dina was saying, is you've got all these people doing really great initiatives, but they struggle to be able to talk to people, other people in the organization, to really, shout out loud about what they're doing to spread the word. So, me supporting them and being able to, get that more higher top level buy-in to create, to push it out inside the organization is one of the key things I really push for.
I agree. Trying to operationalize something like this across a large organization is extremely challenging. And whether it's accessibility, whether it's data governance, whether it's data privacy, trying to get everyone across the board on the same page with something that they don't fully understand what it means, let alone how to follow the processes that may be there, is a challenge. And I think even if there is an accessibility group responsible, all the other groups that need to help implement these standards, these processes, are also so busy with everything else they're doing, they see it as, oh, now I've got to do something more, and I've got to do something extra, and I don't have time. And to Dina's point, there are groups that can do it really, really well, but having that cohesion across the organization and really getting buy-in across and making sure there's the time to do it, that's challenge for large organizations.
Yeah, excellent point there. The idea that this is just something else, right, to tackle, and I have my day job, so why do I also have to do this? Kind of goes hand in hand with this: how do you scale it, operationalize and scale a program, across a large, complex organization? So that's understood, I think, and we articulated that well, from each of you in terms of what those specific challenges look like. And we did touch on in the beginning, that there are companies out there that have embraced this well and are implementing, successful programs. So wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the solutions what's out there? What have you guys seen in terms of practical solutions, things that have been adopted at organizations, or whether it's best practices, it's technology, it's services, tools, etc. That or methodologies, right? It could be focusing their efforts in certain aspects of the life cycle of digital accessibility. So what have you guys seen out there that seems to be working well for larger organizations?
I think I did broadly touch on this, with the executive buy-in in the last question, but ultimately it's about those governance processes and governance programs for me, being able to roll those out with a focus on digital accessibility. This really allows organizations to do it well, and I think it's also really important to emphasize that, a lot of organizations have these problems. There's, these problems aren't unique to a specific organization. But once you do get that buy-in of rolling out that governance process and those governance programs, and there's always a few kind of speed bumps in the beginning, which can cause a few issues, but everyone does eventually get on board, and you can really see this change inside the organizations in terms of inclusivity around how they are actually building out these digital experiences, and people just upskill and they get all these new different skills, and it's really interesting to see.
Buy-in across the
Dana?
board is definitely, sorry, I was going to jump in real quick. Just the buy-in is so critical, right? And you're looking at solutions that involve technology, process, governance, training, culture. There's so many different aspects to it. So we've seen companies, while they're trying to address the problem of both kind of the lack of understanding and it being so big, is prioritizing your needs, right? You can't tackle everything at once. So really making sure you're focused on a roadmap, you've got something tactical that you can start with, and then start embedding it in the process rather than trying to get maybe everyone in the entire world or organization bought in. Start small, right? And then start spreading it from there so you can start getting buy-in from people actually seeing the value. I'm sorry, Dina, go ahead.
No, I was just actually, I would agree. I think a couple things, right? Getting a baseline, like, so for us, right, we have almost 700-ish digital assets that are public facing, right? So getting a baseline of, okay, where are we, right? What is the state of our inventory? And then coming up with metrics. So how do we know if the baseline is getting better, worse, right? And also being able to, help at least figure out what done might look like. But I think the buy-in piece, one of the things that we really try to do, my group really tries to do, is identify our most important stakeholders and really kind of bring ideas to them to say, okay, so we're thinking about doing this thing. Like, do we love it? Do we hate it? Like, what are we thinking about this? And it gives us a chance to hear, kind of like we were talking about before, these amazing perspectives around how they are having to deal with things at the business level, because from this sort of enterprise standpoint, we don't always get to know how hard it might be for them at the business level. And so to hear them firsthand say, yeah, that might be a great idea, but that's never going to work for us in our business because of X, Y, Z. So they bring up things that, I may never have even thought about, or they come up with an alternative to the idea that we've come up with that is way better than my idea. And so it gives us the ability to hear them and to help, I hope, for my Wells people out there, to help them feel involved in the way that we're defining where the enterprise is going. And I think for us, that has helped us be successful, in terms of just not doing things that contradict the needs of the people that we need the most.
Great. Yeah, that's some good detail there in terms of buy-in. How does that process play out? What are the elements of delivering, more organizational buy-in. And I think that engaging stakeholders across the business is key. To feel like there's some level of ownership and influence, and alignment, really, in terms of their direction and strategies. Kind of brings us to our next point here around business impact and value, because to achieve buy-in and get an organization aligned, there needs to be kind of a transaction, right? There needs to be identification of value, ROI associated, like what's in it for me, right? Well, I'm going to buy in, but why? And that's where it gets interesting. And I think that's maybe in terms of like the maturity of the market overall, we're starting to get more mature, I would say, in terms of the ability to articulate value around digital accessibility and what it means from a business impact perspective. So it's an interesting area. It's hard to pin down, I think, in a very quantitative way, but wanted to start to get some perspectives from the panel here on ways that's been delivered or approached with clients and your own organizations.
And Chris, I think that's the challenge, just as you said, right? ROI, key performance indicators can be tricky with accessibilities. And I think that companies struggle to put a value on the impact of potentially losing or not converting a disabled customer. How do you measure something in a sense that doesn't happen? We've worked with companies kind of as Dina said, you catalog and prioritize your digital assets, and you create a scorecard to give you the ability to track your time, track your progress over time until you meet those goals. And again, as Dina said, you've got to understand what those goals are to show that you're meeting them. But the real value that you're getting is the customer satisfaction, doing the right things for your customer. So it can be hard to measure that and put an ROI to it. How do you measure satisfaction and knowing that you're doing the right thing? Dina, are there things you've done at Wells Fargo or other companies?
Well, I think what I would add to this is probably my personal perspective of being in the community, which is that I think there's a lot of misconceptions around, well, we're not going to have very many users with disabilities. They don't really have a lot of market power. They don't really have a lot of money. Really, what's the point in capturing this market? There's very little value in it. And so for those in the financial services industry, because I know that there are quite a few of you on the call, some of the statistics that we've used that are pretty powerful are that, especially for something like wealth management, right? That when you get to the population of people in the United States that are above the age of 64, that about 75% of that population has some sort of disability. And at the same time, that population above the age of 64 controls something like 80% of the United States' available financial assets. So when you hear a statistic like that, is that really a segment of the population that you want to isolate? Because that doesn't sound like a very smart business decision to me, right? And so, trying to find those types of, shock and awe statistics, I think is really important, or statistics around the fact that, the population of people with disabilities in the United States, it's about 57 million people. Well, that's the population of Puerto Rico, Cuba, and all of the Caribbean islands combined. So just imagine just wiping that entire part of the planet off your map of customers.
Yeah, not to mention that element of connections, right? There's 57 million Americans in the U.S. who all have friends and family members that all talk, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. And that whose decisions are influenced by the accessibility of the products and services that they have a choice of buying, right? That, if my mom, sister, whatever can't use something, then I'm not investing in it.
Yep.
Yeah, I would also definitely agree with that. A lot of the times when I'm thinking about, the impact of a website or how people interact with it, I do think of people like my grandparents who are not only would potentially struggle to interact with some of the websites or technology, but they also find it overwhelming. They're scared of interacting with the internet. So being able to, and especially with a lot of things going digital, internet banking, paying bills, giving them that ability and giving them that power, they find it empowering. But as a family member, I'll recommend things to them or specific brands that they can interact with that I know are safe and easy for them to use. So it is, it's not just about, designing for a specific pigeonhole. There's a really big market out there.
Yeah, great stuff there. Really interesting. I think, that actually does come out a lot, which is great. In our kind of client and prospect interactions is trying to help them frame, a value and impact. And it starts with measurement, as you all mentioned, right? That's a imperative. That's table stakes, really, from our perspective, that you have to start to measure this stuff to understand impact over the long term. So it begins there, and then understanding the market and impacts. One of the stats that always jumped out at me was a survey where 71% of disabled users responded that they would click away from a website or bounce out of a website if it's not accessible on the homepage. That's huge, right? 71% of those 57 million Americans won't interact with beyond the first page of a website if it's
Well, and it's
not
the same with
accessible for
apps.
them, right? Yeah.
It's the same with apps. If I open an app and that home screen that I see on the app isn't accessible, I'm like, I'm out. I'm going to delete this off my phone right now
Yeah.
because
Wow.
I can't even get past the home screen.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a great way. You mentioned apps, and right away my head goes in, like, that's obviously the direction of the world, right, that we're living in. Everything's moving to mobile, and apps are as ubiquitous as websites, if not more even. And kind of goes back into this understanding of the current state of accessibility and the world we're living in. And we would be remiss not to sort of acknowledge, like, the dynamic nature of the world we're living in due to the pandemic's impact and the events of last year. So curious, right? Always interesting to hear kind of impact the pandemic's having in different facets of life. But on this topic in particular, digital accessibility, what are some prognostications? What have you seen actually start to change? Maybe Dina, if you want to start on that topic.
So, I mean, what I will say is that, as somebody with a disability, the pandemic has changed everything, right? It's changed so much of my ability to do things independently, like, and it's stupid things, right? Like, so clothing, when I buy clothes, right, I go to a store, I touch the fabric or the style of the thing, and now it's all online, right? So, okay, so I'm relying on somebody else going, what do you think? And their opinion, right? So there's stupid things like that. But then there's more, I have concerns, like, as we roll out vaccines, right? And we're supposed to be notified when it's our turn, so to speak, and we're able to register online. Well, doing a lot of things online as someone with a disability takes a lot of time. And you hear about these scheduling systems crashing or becoming completely full within minutes. Well, it takes me more than minutes to make an appointment. So what is that going to look like for somebody with a disability, right? How accessible is it going to be to be notified that it's your turn, to schedule your turn, to even just from a physical perspective, to get to the place where you're supposed to be vaccinated because it's your turn. So, I mean, I think there's some real implications to how we will continue to be impacted.
Yeah, that's a massive impact. I can imagine that would be a struggle in terms of being able to interact with that. And I think also with the speed that people are trying to build those websites or those experiences and put them out, that they're probably not putting accessibility necessarily at the forefront of being able to build out those digital experiences and making sure that they're accessible and breaking down those barriers. I can also imagine there's a lot of, complex language on those websites as well. So it's a struggle for people to understand, the benefits of the vaccines or, how they would impact them. So it's definitely, a massive change. But also, I think one of the other things that I've seen from an impact in digital experiences is, and Kevin touched on this in the beginning of the webinar, is companies taking a broader approach to diversity and inclusion. They're taking it a lot more seriously now, and they're thinking about how they can actually operationalize it, to focus on those different markets, especially since everyone is working from home now, as opposed to being able to, go to shops and interact with their products.
Yeah, I think you both said it very well. Clearly, there's a huge impact, and there's a lot more people talking about it. The big question is, will all the talk about it, all the concerns, which obviously are very valid concerns, translate into more and more companies actually doing something about it? Clearly, there are a number of companies that make this a priority, but there are even more that don't. And so it's a question of what is it going to take, right? Is the pandemic and everybody working and shopping from home going to be something that pushes people over the edge to really make this a priority? Is it going to take a big fine or lawsuit? What is it going to be to go from all the talk to the actual doing?
Great. That's, yeah, great perspectives there. We'll have to see, right? Oh, maybe we'll have a chance to do a state of digital accessibility in 2022 with this group, and we'll reflect back on the continued impact of the pandemic in 2021 and where we sit a year from now. But that was the last kind of prepared topic for us, and we're happy to jump into questions now. So for those of you in the audience, the chat function on the webinar tool is available there if you want to input some questions that you have. Could be anything, right? Could be relevant to a topic we covered today or not. But welcome your questions over the next 5 to 10 minutes or so. So we'll pause there for a second for people to start to funnel their questions in. I had one, maybe just to kind of kick things off. And it's really one aspect we didn't touch a lot on in the discussion so far is just the legal aspects of digital accessibility. And we touched on compliance as a driver for action. And that is whether we can kind of debate the merits of that, and if that's truly the most effective way to deliver success with a program. The reality is that it is kind of a core driver of activity in the space. And a lot of the legal frameworks that are out there around the ADA and their reference to WCAG, or the precedence of using WCAG as a framework to guide those legal applications is something that's continuing to evolve and big part of the industry. We saw in the last month or so, WCAG 3.0 come out in their first draft of that set of new guidelines. So I wanted to kind of give the panel an opportunity to share any of their perspectives or takeaways from that new issuance from WCAG, and kind of what they see in terms of the current legal framework and so forth.
I was just going to say, when we talk about shock and awe statistics, we got a brief not too long ago about sort of the increase in incidence of lawsuits, like between 2019 and 2020. And one of the things that that struck me was, yes, there was this increase, obviously marked increase in lawsuits, and there has been every year since like 2016. But one of the statistics was that in the last 6 months of 2020, which coincides with sort of the pandemic being at its height, that there was an average of one accessibility related lawsuit filed every day for the last 6 months of 2020.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to see what companies actually do with that and whether they'll start to be more proactive. Certainly in the past, right, as you said, there were a lot of lawsuits that came up. Most companies would look at that and say, what's the bare minimum that I need to do, right, in order to comply with that demand letter, in order to kind of brush this aside, versus, hey, there's a real problem here. Let's figure out how to do something across the organization. So maybe as there's, as you said, more and more DINA coming every single day, maybe as the fines become bigger, it feels like companies do look at that and say, when I'm making a decision, do I make a decision based on cost? And is it cheaper to expect these lawsuits and pay something off, or to actually do the
Mm-hmm.
work? And I think in the
Right.
past, certainly a lot of companies have looked at that and say, well, it's too expensive. I don't know where to start. We're going to get lawsuits. We're going to get fines. So great, we'll pay that because it's less expensive to do that
Right.
than run a program, and hoping that will turn around a little bit.
Well, I think the reputational damage too is something where there has been more leverage, right? Like if you think about the Domino's lawsuit, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
if you're in the accessibility community, like all you have to do is go, yeah, talk to Domino's about like how it works when you go all the way to the Supreme Court to try to tell them you don't have to do accessibility, and you get shut down, and every single person in the accessibility field watches you fight against being accessible.
Yeah, I think it's going to take, unfortunately, probably a couple more things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's the
Yep.
perfect example.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, yeah, in the industry, I think with a lot of the organizations, one lawsuit, they could potentially afford to pay or kind of push to the side. But now organizations are getting 2, 3, 4, 5, and that definitely starts to add up. And you don't want to be that organization who has that kind of pile of stack of lawsuits sitting there. So definitely starting to operationalize those processes and programs and moving towards building those inclusive experiences.
So getting some questions in here now from the audience. I appreciate everyone, providing those questions. Getting a few around kind of tactical items of implementing the programs that we're talking about. How would you recommend starting? Would you run an audit and then make decisions from there? Are there good tools out there, technology? Of course, Crown Peak offers some technology, so there's an answer to one of those. But we'll let the panelists respond as well. What digital tools would you suggest large corporations use to implement and manage digital accessibility? Some of those more tactical elements of how you would recommend companies do this.
So, I mean, I guess what I would say is, particularly if you're coming into a company where you've got, some people that are already trying to do this work, ask them, right? Like, what's going well? What's not going well? What do you need? Like, if you could make a problem go away today, what would what would that be, right? Like, I think it's so important. The people that are fighting this fight every day will tell you what they need. And yes, you need tools, you need training, you need a baseline, like you need all those things. But one of the key ways I think to know what you need is to listen to the people that are trying so hard to do this already.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, at Crown Peak, we speak about essentially a maturity curve on where people are when it does come to digital accessibility. I think it's also important to emphasize that no two organizations are the same. So it is really about, talking to the people who are on the ground, understanding their knowledge, understanding the gaps in, what they want to achieve and how far away they are getting, from getting there. Automated technology, I think, is a great benefit in terms of understanding the baseline of where you are. Obviously, if a website has a lot of issues, that would have, it might be better to kind of start from scratch and, redo the whole website as opposed to trying to, tape over the problems. But, automated technology definitely allows you to get that kind of baseline, and then you can kind of try to understand where you are on that digital maturity curve when it does come to, and fully accessible experience.
Okay. So another one, this is a good question. This idea of how you get started and how to kind of build a program. So as a company starts its journey in terms of becoming more accessible, in the absence of an executive sponsor or executive buy-in, as you put it, how else do you recommend getting the word out across the org regarding digital accessibility best practices? You can't go up to your, VP and sell him and get him to shout from the rooftops that this is an imperative. You can't do that. What else can you do? How do you start to do that more from a more grassroots perspective, I guess, is the essence of the question.
So, I mean, I'm just going to be really honest and say that without executive buy-in, you can have the most passionate, brilliant, innovative people, and you can try really hard to do change management. But fundamentally, if you don't have executive buy-in, it doesn't work. It just doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I completely agree, because you need the time, you need the funding, you need the goals that you're all trying to accomplish and get aligned. You absolutely have to have that executive buy-in. Couldn't agree more, Dina.
I mean, you need the Satya Nadellas who get up in front of their company and say, I'm not asking you to do this. I'm telling you,
Right.
this is who we are.
Absolutely. I think that's a great kind of clear response. It's, you really can't, you need that leadership, and it's like with other aspects of organizational health and performance, leadership really does need to, help kind of drive imperatives and priorities in action. So great question, great way to end the discussion here. And just want to thank everyone again, for joining us today. And thank you to the panelists, Dina, Kevin, Catherine. Fantastic discussion. Really appreciate spending the time. It's a fascinating topic, as I hope everyone who's listening felt engaged in the topics as well. Looking forward to maybe another session like this in the near future. And as I mentioned at the top end of the discussion, we'll be sending out a recording and transcript will be made available of the webinar. And please feel free to reach out to Crown Peak, Logic 2020, Dina, for any follow-up questions or feedback. So with that, I'll say thank you, and have a good rest of your day.